Hi everyone. So as you can see, this is going to be a chill one. But if you read the title of today's video, then you know I'm going to be ranking every villain of Vampire Diaries. And if you don't want to hear my rules and parameters, which I always recommend you stick around for, you can skip to this timestamp right here. Otherwise, I'm going to get into my rules and parameters. So first off, if you haven't seen Vampire Diaries in a little bit, I actually did a recapping and ranking of every single season of Vampire Diaries about almost 2 years ago. That'll be the first link in the description. I actually watched that video in preparation for this video because I was like, I've already done it once. I don't want to have to go through every single season of Vampire Diaries all over again. Another reason I like taking physical notes versus notes on my computer is one, it saves up storage on my computer, and second, because I have my Vampire Diary notes from my original video right here that I can look back on to make sure that I'm getting all this information correct. And now, like, what constitute a villain in Vampire Diaries? Because to be honest, going through it, there's different numbers of villains each season, and with some seasons there are people who are villains over multiple seasons because each season is a continuation of the story. So someone who is a villain in season 1 has the potential to be a villain in season 5 because they've just come back around and are still up to the same shenanigans. I tried to avoid repeats. It was hard sometimes, especially with two certain characters whose names just so happen to both start with a K. But what I constituted as a villain was someone or a group of people that were the big bad that are main people, that being Damon, Elena, Stefan, Bonnie, Caroline, what have you. Our group of core people have to fight in order to save Mystic Falls or save themselves from danger. And because Vampire Diaries is one of those TV shows that still had like 45-minute episodes and 22 episodes for a season, there are actually multiple villains that come and go throughout the same exact seasons. I think the highest number of villains we have in one season is about 4, and the lowest number we have is 1. But yeah, that is kind of like my little spiel. That's kind of what I use to decide who was a villain. If I left someone off the list that you thought I should include on this list, please feel free to put that in the comment section down below. I tried to do my best to include everyone I believed was a villain in Vampire Diaries. I, of course, didn't include people who were villains for like one episode, or like, for example, there's Ketsia. I didn't include Ketsia because Ketsia is one of those people who was only there for about 2 to 3 episodes and did like one little thing, but that was it.
And when I say one little thing, I don't literally mean one little thing. I understand she helped Stefan and she also made Bonnie the anchor to the other side. What I mean by that is like she was there helping more than she was hurting, especially when you compare her to villains of the season like Silas.
So I didn't include people like that in the list. Also, I should say, obviously there's going to be spoilers. Of course, I'm not going to be spoiling everything as this is not a full-on recap, but I am going to be spoiling plot points. So if you have not seen Vampire Diaries in a while, or you don't want me to spoil the show for you because you've never seen it, I would definitely recommend watching the show or watching my video down below. Just know there's going to be spoilers, okay? Now, let's get into season 1 of Vampire Diaries, the villains of season 1 of Vampire Diaries. So the first villains we come across is the Tomb Vampires. And the Tomb Vampires are a group of vampires originally from Mystic Falls who were trapped in a tomb back in like the 1800s when Mystic Falls was going through kind of like a vampire craze, kind of like how the Salem witch trials was gathering up all the witches and burning them. Mystic Falls was having that same exact thing but with vampires, and the Tomb Vampires didn't go in there because they were trapped in there by the villagers. They went in there because they were trying to escape the villagers. How they get out of this tomb is because Damon, who was trying to find Catherine, who he believed was supposed to be in the tomb, had Bonnie and her grandmother open the tomb to look for Catherine. She doesn't end up being in there, but because performing the spell to even open the tomb was just so much stress on Bonnie and her grandmother does end up getting X'd, which means that Bonnie does not have enough power to close the tomb, which inevitably allows the Tomb Vampires to escape the tomb and be free in Mystic Falls. They end up living in a house together and basically terrorizing our main cast of people. Now, of course, this torment isn't one-sided. Damon does, torment them as well, which inevitably causes the Tomb Vampires to capture Stefan and torture him. And at the the end of the battle, I should say, that takes place of our main heroes trying to save Stefan, a few of the tomb vampires get X'd. Stefan obviously gets saved, but not without starting to drink human blood again, because at the end of the battle he was too weak to fight for himself, so Elena gives him his blood. And so, that goes into a whole separate storyline that ends up happening throughout the rest of the season. And this is also not the end of our tomb vampires, because our tomb vampires kind of lead into our next villain of the season. But as for a villain, I would consider the tomb vampires, especially compared to the other ones on this list, to not be that much of a threat. They were not there for that long, and they were not, I believe, equipped enough to understand the 21st century. It just seems like they were out of practice, which is one of the reasons I believe it was very easy for our group of heroes to defeat them. It didn't take them more than an episode. They were like terrorizing each other, but it didn't take more than just going to their house and kicking and punching and Xing people along the way to destroy most of the tomb gang of vampires. So for that, number 1 would be the most villainous villain, and 20 would be the least villainous villain. And as for the villains I have on here, I'm honestly going to put the tomb vampires at 17. The next and final villain we have for season 1 is, I would argue, is John Gilbert, who we end up finding out is Elena's biological father. We think he's her uncle in most of the first season, but it's revealed that he's her father. But anyway, John comes into town not long after the tomb vampire thing. His story kind of coincides with the tomb vampire situation that ends up happening, because he ends up terrorizing our main group of heroes, and he quickly inserts himself into situations, that being Elena's life as a controlling parent. And for Damon and Stefan, he's like, I know you guys are vampires, and I might not say anything now, but if you don't start acting and moving the way I want you to act and move, I'm going to reveal you to the council, which obviously would not be good for Stefan and Damon. But he also comes into town with the intent of using the Gilbert device, which is a device that was introduced with the Tomb Vampire storyline. And it is basically a device that incapacitates mystical creatures for a certain amount of time. And what he ends up doing is, during a celebration, he activates the Gilbert device, and because the device messes with mystical creatures, it reveals them to the townspeople. And within his group, he gets these people to gather up different mystical creatures, that being the rest of the tomb vampires and the mayor of the town. And he ends up putting them into a basement and setting them on fire. He almost ends up Xing Damon, but he does not get the chance to, as Damon is able to escape with the help of our other heroes. John does end up coming back, but I would argue that when he comes back, he doesn't end up coming back as a villain. He does give us some more insight, and he is, I would argue, one of the many reasons that we actually get Catherine back into Mystic Falls, which I'm mentioning that now because it's important to season 2, because John ends up becoming a victim more than a villain in the last episode of season 1, when he actually gets attacked by Catherine. But as for his villainess, where I would put him on this list is, I would honestly put him higher than the tomb vampires, because he was able to destroy the rest of the tomb vampires, not even by his own hands like Damon and Stefan and them. He did it by using a device he knew would take them out, or at least expose them so he could take them out. So I'd put him at 16, but I wouldn't put him higher than that, because he still didn't do that much. Next on this list, I have Catherine slash the Lockwood boys. And the reason I was a bit iffy as to including them on this list is, first of all, spoiler, Catherine comes up as a villain on this list multiple times. And I didn't want to have her on here like 5 times, but she does end up being a big villain during different seasons at different points. So, you have to give the woman her flowers.
I would also like to say, when I'm talking about the Lockwood Boys, I was kind of using that as an umbrella term to talk about Tyler and also the werewolves that do inevitably come to town. I don't mention them as much in this ranking because they do terrorize our group the same way that Catherine does, but inevitably their stint as a villain ends around the same time that Catherine's stint as a villain ends, when Elijah comes to town. So I don't mention them a lot, but it doesn't really change my ranking, if that makes sense.
But in this season, Catherine comes back to town and she starts terrorizing the town. She's there to get the Moonstone because she's there to negotiate her freedom with Klaus, who also does end up making an appearance in this season. But back to Catherine, she acts like Elena. She threatens our main group of people. She actually uses Elena at one point. Like, there's this one scene at a party where they're actually trying to ex Catherine, but Catherine has a witch link her and Elena. So everything the boys do to Catherine ends up happening to Elena. And as for the Lockwood boys, one of the Lockwood boys is Tyler's uncle, and he is there basically with Catherine. And Catherine is using him, but he, with Catherine, are on defense against our main group of heroes. You kind of have this thing where Tyler's uncle and Damon are kind of going back at each other until Damon actually ends up Xing Tyler's uncle. That's really what Catherine does in this season, which is why I'm only putting her at 18, because compared to what she does in later seasons, this is not that much of a big deal. I understand why she was doing it. Of course, it was kind of like a mixture of her having fun and toying with our group of heroes, and also her coming here to do something to benefit herself. In every single season, everything she does is to benefit herself. And so yeah, I'm going to put this Catherine and the Lockwood boys at the number 18 spot. Next is Elijah, and this is the first introduction we have to a original. And Elijah was a bit iffy for me to include on this list, but the reason I included him on this list is because his storyline kind of coincides with Klaus's storyline. He's the next villain of this season, which I'll get into, but I'll focus on Elijah right now. Elijah comes to Mystic Falls looking for the Moonstone because, I would argue, because of Catherine and because the hearings of the Moonstone. The reason that Elijah is looking for the Moonstone is because the Moonstone is actually a key part of a ritual that Klaus wants to perform, so he's able to access his hybrid side. And as for villains go, I would say Elijah in this season is one of the most tame villains that you will ever come across in your life. He's a very reasonable man. I put that in air quotes because he's reasonable up until a certain point when he will flip that switch and flip on you. Like, for example, throughout this season, throughout him being a villain, he actually makes deals with Elena that he does keep to a certain extent up into a certain point, but he is a bit wishy-washy about it, especially because, you know, he needs Elena and he needs Elena along with the Moonstone, but he doesn't need like Damon and Stefan, who are actively, you know, trying to keep Elena away from him and trying to take out Elijah as a threat. Like, there's this one point where he's just standing outside of a coffee shop and he starts like tossing coins in his hand, and he throws the coins at the coffee shop window, breaking the glass and basically burning the coffee shop full of vampires. And then he just, like, you know, walks away like nothing happens. That was just a warning to him. That was a warning. So y'all, my septum ball just fell out of my nose. It hit the mic. I don't know if you heard that. I'm gonna go screw this back on and I will be right back. I'm going to be honest with you, I do not remember what I was saying, but I believe what I was saying was that I was putting Elijah at 15. Actually, I think I will put Elijah at 12 because I think he's what, like, again, he's one of our more calm villains, but he still is a scary villain. Next, we have a bit of a mixture. The reason I say that is because in this season, Klaus does end up possessing Aloric, so having his consciousness inside of Aloric's body, but then at the end of the season, he does return to his own body. So I'm, instead of having that be two separate villains, because it is technically the same person, I'm going to combine what he does in Aloric's body with what he does in his own body for the entire season. So as for a recap of what Klaus does in this season, he basically possesses Aloric to infiltrate the group without being known, and he does this because to complete his ritual, so he's able to unlock his hybrid side, he wants to get rid of Bonnie. I believe the reason he's doing this is because Bennett witches have the potential to stop him from being able to break his hybrid curse, so he needs Bonnie out of the way, and possessing Aloric is a way for him to infiltrate the group to do that, which is exactly what he does, and he ends up Xing Bonnie. And the reason I say that is because during the dance in Aloric's body, he tries to overwhelm Bonnie, and she makes it seem as though she is gone when in fact she just does it to lay low, to not, you know, expose that she is still alive. Otherwise, Klaus would continue to come after her. And then eventually he does get back to his own body, and within his own body, he basically gathers everything he needs to complete and break his curse. And what he does is that he ends up turning Elena's aunt, the person who has been taking care of her since her parents passed, he turns her into a vampire in retaliation against Elena and her group for, messing with his plans. And so he ends up Xing her as a part of the ritual. He also ends up Xing Elena in the ritual so that he's able to become a hybrid. Of course, Elena doesn't end up passing because of John, who ends up giving his life so Elena can live. But at the end of it, Elijah at the last minute tries to come in and X Klaus. And Klaus makes a deal with Elijah saying, I'm the only one who knows where our siblings are, and I know that's who you want. So if you come with me, if you don't X me, I'll be able to show you where our siblings are. So then Elijah ends up betraying the group. So that's another reason as to why I put him at the number 12 position. And as for Klaus, this is one of his many times that he ends up showing up on this list. But I would say for what he does in season 2, I'd have to put this at the number 9 spot because Klaus is a very petty villain, like turning Jenna and making her the vampire when there are a plethora of vampires he could have used. He did that out of spite and out of anger. And also, he's using people and doing things for his own bidding, and he doesn't necessarily care. So that's another reason why I put him at the number 9 spot. And so next, now we are getting into season 3. And for season 3, our first villain that we meet again is Klaus. At this point, Klaus has been traveling around the country with Stefan. The reason that Klaus has Stefan is because at the end of season 2, Stefan gave up his freedom and promised Klaus that he would become a Ripper and travel with him if he saved Damon's life, because at the end of season 2, Damon gets bit by a werewolf, which werewolf bites are fatal to vampires. And so Klaus and Stefan have just been, again, terrorizing everyone across multiple states around the United States. And the reason that Klaus is doing this is because he's trying to find werewolf packs and he is trying to make more hybrids. But he is having no luck, and he doesn't understand why he's having no luck with turning people into hybrids like he is. Eventually, of course, he does find out the reason as to why he can't make any more hybrids, and it is because of Elena. I'm not going to get completely into it, but he inevitably sends No Humanity Stefan to protect Elena just so that he can make hybrids. And so throughout the season, Klaus, he's going back and forth between, I'd say, being a big villain and being a subpar villain. And that is because after a certain point, Stefan ends up unstaking all of his siblings, and his mother ends up waking up. And so once his family is actually back together, he isn't necessarily a big bad anymore, or a villain in the same way that he was before his family was off the table. Because of that, I'll be putting this version of Klaus at the number 15 spot. The next villain we have is what I will call Evil Aloric. Evil Aloric comes about because Aloric wears a Gilbert ring, which is a ring that can bring you back from being X'd if you were X'd by a supernatural being. And what happens is the more you get X'd wearing this ring, yes, you come back, but you come back with different tendencies. And the tendencies that Aloric ends up coming back with is wanting to X all supernatural beings. And so remember, like I said, Klaus's family comes back, and Klaus's mom puts a spell on Aloric that allows him to have the powers of a vampire, but the lifespan of a human. And also, he is given a white oak stake that can be used over and over again as his weapon. So Klaus's mother's plan was to X her children, which if you X an original, it X's their entire bloodlines. And so, he does trap Caroline, he does hold Elena hostage, and basically just uses them as pawns to gain access to the originals. But this ends up not, working out in his favor, as Elena gets ran off a bridge at the last episode and, X's herself, which takes away his powers, and he gets X'd. So as for a villain, I'm going to put him at the number 8 spot, because when it comes to villains, I think he was a big terror. And I should say, I didn't put their dad on this list because he doesn't show up that often. Like, he shows up for like 1 to 2 episodes at a time, and then he gets thrown off the map and isn't a villain anymore. So I would say, compared to the Michelson father, Aloric was one of the first ones to actually scare an original, which is, I would say, a big thing. So actually, I'm not even going to put him at 8. I'm going to put him at 5. Yes, 5 is my final number. I keep changing it. Sorry. I'm going to put him at 5. Next, we are going into season 4. And The evil of season 4 are the hunters. And basically, what the hunters are is they are a group, not necessarily a group as in they're together all the time, but they are a group, is the word I would use, of vampire hunters that were created back in like the 1400s by a witch to X vampires. And the more vampires that they X, they grow a tattoo. And the tattoo is only able to be seen by fellow hunters or potential hunters. And Jeremy ends up being able to see this mark, which goes into more of the plot of the season. But I would say, as for when it comes to villains of the season, the hunters are very, very tame, believe it or not, compared to other villains of other seasons. They are actually, in fact, the only villain of this season. And I wouldn't say they end up being that potent of a villain. I don't know what other word to use, because they are regular humans, so they don't have like supernatural strength or supernatural abilities like vampires or witches have. The only thing I think they have going for them is that if you end up Xing a hunter, that hunter will be able to haunt you for the rest of your vampire existence, which for vampires, they're immortal. The vampire hunter that does end up coming into the season, he does do some outlandish things like trying to stake Tyler in the middle of a funeral, bleeding a human dry just to get at vampires. But again, compared to even some of the villains we've just said on this list, I would say he's as potent of a villain as Catherine in the Lockwood Boys from season 2. So for that, I'll put them at 19. I should also say we do come across a hunter when they do get to the island, but we only see him for like 2.5 seconds and he doesn't make much of a mark. So yeah, again, I will put them at number 19. The next villain we have is in season 5, and this is Silas. As for what Silas does, he is the villain that we get off the island. He is the original version of Stefan. Stefan is a doppelganger, and so it is easy for him to infiltrate his way into Mystic Falls because Stefan has a good track record with the entire town, and he just ends up terrorizing the town because it's fun for him, because he's kind of like a witch. He is an immortal witch, and his entire goal is to basically X the entire season. He just wants to take an eternal nap. So everything he does is for fun, but is also so that he's able to find the love of his life and to get rid of the other side where supernatural beings go after they pass away, and just again take a long nap. And for that, I'd put Silas at 14. He does cause a bit of havoc. He does end up Xing Bonnie's father and messing with the gang, but I would say he causes the most harm to Stefan, and that's because at the end of season 4, he trapped Stefan at the bottom of a quarry, so Stefan was just drowning over and over and over again for months. And once he actually does get the original version of Elena, he is pretty subdued, kind of like how Klaus was in season 3. So for that, I'll put him at 11, which is right above Elijah, because I would say when it comes to what they do, if you're comparing the two, Elijah has a longer fuse and Silas has a shorter fuse, but they both have that fuse. And once they got what they wanted, they were pretty harmless. Next are the Travelers, which, to kind of summarize what Travelers are, they are a coven, I guess you could say, of witches who can put their consciousness into different people's bodies, and their entire goal is to basically bring back their leader from the other side. And I also put Catherine with the Travelers again because her daughter is a Traveler, and so that kind of connects Catherine to the Travelers, because in this season, Catherine does get turned human and does end up Xing, but puts herself in Elena's body, so she doesn't get X'd. It's kind of weird, but I don't know. The Travelers, the most crucial and villainous things they do is they take part in destroying the other side, and they also put kind of like this magical spell on Mystic Falls that means no magical creatures can enter Mystic Falls without their magic being stripped away. The example I gave in my video was that it was if Stefan were to enter Mystic Falls, he would become human again and be inflicted by the same gunshot wound that X'd him when he was originally turned into a vampire. I would say those are the top two things that they were able to do. So because of that, I'd put them at the number 4 spot, because I feel like that is a lot more potent of a more villainous thing to do Then let's say for right below that is Eva Aloric, who scared the originals, which I think is a big title to hold. But being able to draw mystical creatures out of a town and also to take down the other side, a magical place that has existed for hundreds of years, make you a pretty big villain, even though I wouldn't say they hurt our group in the same physical ways as other villains have, if that makes sense. So I will put them at number 4. An honorable mention I have is the Augustine. I'm not putting them on this list because they only mentioned a little bit. They do give us Enzo, which becomes a big player in later seasons. I also didn't include Enzo as a villain because it's a bit tricky because he just ends up becoming one of our heroes. But I'll give them an honorable mention because for a short period of time they do terrorize our group, but not enough for it to outweigh the Travelers and Silas. It's more of like they become a subplot, so that's the reason why they just get an honorable mention and not a spot on the list. But going into season 6, we have Kai. I would say Kai has to be one of my favorite Vampire Diary villains, and that is because of how sarcastic and also unpredictable and how much of a terrible person he is. In this season, we meet Kai in his prison world, and we find out he is in his prison world because of the fact that he massacred majority of his family and he wants to take over the Gemini Coven. I would say he inflicts the most amount of pain on Bonnie at a certain point in the season, but then he also inflicts pain on Aloric because he exes Aloric's wife on their wedding day. He also ends up exing his other sibling and becomes the leader of the Gemini Coven, and then he exes himself so that he exes the rest of the Gemini Coven. It's crazy, but stick with me here. As for villains, I don't know. I'm a bit conflicted because I want to put him at the number 2 spot, but when it comes to like the amount of terrible things he brings on people, I don't think it outweighs what the Travelers have done. So I'm going to put him at the number 3 spot. Next, we have the Heretics and Julian. I'll put them in the same category because Julian he's only a big bad for a short period of time in the season. I'd argue that the next villain of season 7 has more of an impact than him, but the Heretics are basically, they were also trapped in a separate prison world than Kai was, but they come from a prison world and they are vampires who are also witches, and what they do is kind of like the same things that the Travelers do, and they take over the town of Mystic Falls. They make it so that every human has to move out and the only people in the town are them and the Salvators. And I mean, the most potent thing that they do is Julian again already takes over the town that they had already taken over. So while like Kai, all their blows are more so personal, it's not as like terrible as, let's say like the Travelers or Evil Aloric. So that's why I'm honestly going to put them at the number 20 spot. Like I just don't think they were that terrible. Now getting into our next and last villain of season 7, and that is Reyna the Huntress. She basically is a mythical vampire hunters with like 7 or 9 lives. I don't remember the specific number. And she hunts with this sword that has a stone on it, and the stones trap the vampire that it has stuck in it in like their own personal prison. And I think she's a lot more scary than I would even say Evil Aloric. Everyone fears her because people fear being put inside the Phoenix Stone because it's arguably a fate worse than, death. Yes, you can come back from it, but as Damon and Stefan both know from being put in the stone earlier in the season, it's just not a fate that you want to succumb to. The originals know that as well. Like at one point, I believe Stefan calls Klaus and Klaus comes. He notices that Stefan is marked by Reyna's sword and he's mad at him because he's like, why are you bringing that misfortune upon my doorstep? Now, I would say that Reyna does become a bit more subdued when her stone is destroyed by 2 of the heretics. Like she is plagued by the thoughts of every single person she's ever exed with the stone. Mind you, this woman has been doing this for hundreds of years, and she does also inevitably end up giving her last life, her huntress powers, to Bonnie. So I would say as a villain, she's a bit more reasonable, but she still is on her 10s and 2s. So honestly, I'd want to put her one above Eva Aloric because while Aloric and her were both hunters, she was more immortal, and because again, again, when she would stab you, her thing is a fate worse than death versus Aloric is just night night. So I'm going to put her at 6. I'm probably also going to have to rework this list because I'm not sure I even have 20 people to talk about and I have spots that are still open. So I might have to end up reworking it before I say my final list. But as of right now, yeah, she's going at number 6. Next, we have the Sirens, that being Sybil and Celine. They come into play as our first villains of season 8. And I can already tell you I'm putting them at the number 14 spot because as villains, yes, Sybil does end up taking control of Enzo and Damon, but they are working for a bigger bad, and everything that they do, I would say, is not as terrible of a thing as some of our other villains. And also, once the person they're working for comes into play, they actually get X'd. So yeah, I'm just going to put them at the number 14 spot. Next is Cade, and Cade is the leader of Downstairs. Okay, so I would say season 8 is a bit like harder to explain, but Cade basically is in control. You know, there is no other side now. So when supernatural beings get X'd, he is where they go. Also, when it comes to Cade being a villain, he doesn't do a lot of stuff himself. He actually has people do things for him. Like, for example, he had control of Sybil and Celine, and then around the end of the season, he ends up gaining control of Stefan and Damon, and he actually puts No Humanity Stefan out into the world, and he ends up Xing Enzo right in front of Bonnie. So when it comes to villains, I'm putting him at the number 13 spot because if he doesn't have to get his hands dirty, he's not. He just makes people do things for him. So, there's not much like, you can say about him, especially because for him to be the big bad downstairs, he gets defeated very quickly by Bonnie. Last but not least, the final villain we have of season 8, the last season of Vampire Diaries, is Catherine. Yes, she is back for the final and last time because Cade gets destroyed. She becomes the person in charge of downstairs, and she basically has Vicky ring this bell that only the Donovan family can ring, and it is set to destroy Mystic Falls and everyone in the town. But Bonnie ends up saving the town, and Stefan ends up giving his life because at this point he's human. If you want to understand why, it's a lot more to explain than I can explain here. But Stefan ends up giving his life to destroy Catherine. She comes in at the last minute as the last villain, so it's a bit wishy-washy to include her here. I included her here because she's the last villain of season 8, but compared to the other stuff that she did, I would say this is a bit more subdued compared to, season 2 Catherine and like season 4 Catherine or what have you. So I'm going to put her at the number 10 spot because that's the only lowest spot I have left. So yeah, she's going in the number 10 spot. Okay, so because I've had more spots open than I thought I would, I'm not going to like say my list as I have it right now because I can't tell you who's at number 1 because there is no one at number 1 or number 2. There's no one at number 7 or number 8. So I'm going to revamp this list, as in fix the number order and possibly move a few people around, and then I will give you my final list of the most villainous to the least villainous. So I will see you in like 2 seconds for you. This might be about 10 minutes for me because it always takes me a lot longer than it should to do this. But yeah. Okay, so as for my reworked list, I'm going to start at the top with the most villainous to the last one, which is actually number 16, the least villainous. So starting from the top, we have Kai, the Travelers, Reina Cruz, Evil Aloric, Klaus inside of Aloric, Silas, Elijah, Klaus slash Stefan, John Gilbert, the Tomb Vamps, the Sirens, Cade, Catherine and the Lockwood Boys, the Hunters, Season 8 Catherine, and the Heretics. If you have a different list or you would have put someone else somewhere else, please let me know down in the comment section down below. But thank you so much for watching this video. Like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more of me. I will not be posting next Wednesday as I will be somewhere where I will not be able nor have the time to post. So there will be no video from me next week. But other than that, I do post every Wednesday. I hope you have a good weekend, weekday, weeknight, and bye.